Have you ever felt like the forest was alive, watching you, testing you, waiting for you to make one wrong move? I have. And let me tell you, it's not just your imagination. It started like any other camping trip. Just me and three friends, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect with nature. We picked the Opal Creek Wilderness, a place known for its crystal clear streams and towering trees. But no one warned us about the shadows. I still remember the moment everything changed. We were deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the pale glow of our flashlights to guide us. That's when I heard it, my name. Jack. The voice came from behind me, soft, almost familiar. But when I turned, there was no one there. Just the trees, silent and still, as if holding their breath. A few minutes later, it happened again, but this time it wasn't my name being called. It was Emily's. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The forest had already claimed us. This is the story of what happened to us in the Opal Creek Wilderness. And if you think you'd make it out alive, stick around to the end. But I'll warn you, it's not just a wilderness you have to survive. So hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notifications, because this is a story you won't forget. Would you dare to go into the woods after hearing this? Let me know in the comments. There's something about the wilderness that draws you in, isn't there? The promise of fresh air, endless skies, and a break from the monotony of life. That's exactly what we were chasing when we decided to spend a long weekend in the Opal Creek Wilderness. It was supposed to be simple. No phones, no deadlines. Just four friends reconnecting with nature. There was me, Jack, the planner and self-proclaimed outdoorsman. Emily, my college friend and budding photographer, who wanted nothing more than to capture the beauty of untouched forests. Kevin, my laid-back roommate who brought enough snacks to feed an army, and Amanda, our group skeptic, who rolled her eyes every time we brought up ghost stories or campfire myths. Opal Creek was the perfect spot for our escape. Known for its pristine trails, ancient trees, and the ruins of old mining camps, the area seemed like it was plucked straight from a postcard. But the locals we spoke to on the way weren't as enthusiastic. "Y'all going out to Jawbone Flats?" An old man at the gas station asked as he handed us our change. His face was lined, his eyes sharp. "It's beautiful out there, but don't go wandering. Too far off the trails. Some places are best left alone." We laughed it off, assuming he was just being dramatic. It wasn't the first time someone tried to spook us with vague warnings. By the time we reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was painting the forest in hues of gold. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Jawbone Flats, a ghost town turned conservation site, greeted us with its crumbling cabins and rusted mining equipment. Emily was already snapping pictures, marveling at how the forest was reclaiming the remnants of human activity. "Creepy but cool," Kevin said, nudging a rusted wheelbarrow with his boot. "Bet this place has seen some wild stuff." Amanda scoffed. "Or it's just a bunch of old junk. Let's not romanticize it." But even she couldn't deny the atmosphere. The silence was almost too perfect, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant chirp of a bird. We set up camp near an old cabin just off the main trail. The spot felt isolated but safe, surrounded by towering fir trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. As we unpacked, I felt the excitement bubbling in my chest. This was going to be the perfect trip. After a quick dinner around the campfire, Emily brought out her map, pointing to a small, unmarked path leading deeper into the forest. "I heard there's an abandoned mine somewhere out there," she said, her eyes lighting up. "If we leave early tomorrow, We can check it out and still make it back by evening." "An abandoned mine?" Amanda raised an eyebrow. "What's next? You want to summon ghosts with a Ouija board?" "Relax," I said with a laugh. "It'll be fun. A little adventure never hurt anyone." Looking back now, I realize how naive we were, how we ignored the weight in the air, the way the trees seemed to lean closer, as if listening. But at the time, we were just four friends ready to lose ourselves in the beauty of the wilderness. We had no idea what was waiting for us. The next morning, we set out early. The air was cool and crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. Emily led the way, map in hand, with her camera swinging around her neck. Kevin trailed behind, munching on a granola bar, while Amanda kept muttering about how everything looks the same out here. At first, it felt like any other hike. The trail was narrow but clear, winding through towering trees that seemed to block out everything else. But as we got deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to shift. The cheerful chatter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Amanda asked, glancing around. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Probably just means we're far from the main trails." But it wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, the kind of silence that made you feel like you shouldn't be there, like you were intruding. Then we found the carvings. Emily spotted them first. Strange, humanoid figures etched into the bark of a tree. Their limbs were long and jagged, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side. "What the hell?" Kevin muttered, running his fingers over the grooves. "Probably some old miner art," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "They don't look like miners to me," Amanda said, snapping a photo with her phone. "Why are their arms so wrong?" We moved on, but the unease followed us. Not long after, we stumbled across another unsettling sight, a small clearing littered with animal bones. They were scattered in deliberate patterns, arranged in concentric circles. "Okay, now this is officially creepy," Kevin said, stepping back. Emily knelt down, snapping pictures. "Maybe it's some kind of ritual site. Or maybe it's time to turn around," Amanda said, folding her arms. I forced a laugh, trying to shake the tension. "Come on, it's probably just some weird natural phenomenon." But as we continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every now and then I thought I saw a movement in the corner of my eye. Something wasn't right, but none of us were ready to admit it. Not yet. By the time we found the mine shaft, the day was already wearing thin. The trail had dissolved into nothing more than overgrown underbrush, and the forest seemed to close in on us with every step. "Are we even going the right way?" Amanda grumbled, shoving aside a branch that nearly smacked her in the face. "I'm following the map," Emily said, her voice strained but determined. "It should be around here somewhere." Kevin, sweating despite the cool air, let out a frustrated sigh. "Well, if this map of yours doesn't lead us to a pot of gold, I'm rioting." But Emily wasn't wrong. Moments later, the trees opened up, and there it was, a gaping hole in the earth, framed by the rotting remains of a wooden structure. The entrance to the old mine shaft. The air around the mine felt different, cooler, heavier, as if the forest itself recoiled from the place. The wooden beams framing the entrance were warped and splintered, barely holding up the crumbling rocks above. Rusted tracks led into the darkness, disappearing into a void that swallowed the light. "This is it," Emily said, her excitement cutting through the eerie quiet. She immediately began snapping photos. oblivious to the unease settling over the rest of us. "I don't know about this," Amanda said, keeping a safe distance from the entrance. "This place looks like it could collapse any second." Kevin peered into the darkness, squinting as if trying to make out something deeper inside. "Man, this looks straight out of a horror movie. What do you think, Jack?" I hesitated, my gaze fixed on the mine's entrance. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't just dark, but a different kind of darkness, the kind that watches you back. "We're not going in," I said finally. "It's too dangerous." But Emily wasn't listening. She stepped closer to the entrance, her camera clicking as she photographed the decaying beams and rusted tracks. Then we heard it, a faint noise, so soft I almost thought I imagined it, a rhythmic tapping like something or someone knocking deep inside the mine. "Did you hear that?" Kevin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Amanda stepped back, her face pale. "Okay, nope. That's it. We're leaving." Emily tilted her head, listening. "It's probably just rocks shifting," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like a knock meant to get your attention. "Emily," I said, my voice firm, "back away from the entrance. Now." Before she could respond, the tapping stopped. Silence, and then a whisper. "Come in." It was barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind, but we all heard it. Amanda froze, her eyes wide. Kevin stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. Did someone just talk?" Kevin stammered. "No," Emily said, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself. "It's just the wind." But the look on her face told me she didn't believe it. None of us did. I stepped forward, grabbing Emily by the arm and pulling her back from the mine. "We're leaving," I said, more forcefully this time. "Now." As we turned to go, the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Don't leave." We didn't wait to find out what it meant. We hurried back the way we came, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was different now. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. None of us said a word as we trudged back to camp, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was in that mine, it didn't want us to leave. By the time we got back to camp, the unease had settled into a heavy silence. Even Kevin, who usually couldn't go 5 minutes without cracking a joke, was uncharacteristically quiet. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, as though expecting to see something or someone emerge from the trees behind us. "Are we not going to talk about what happened back there?" Amanda finally blurted, her voice shaking. She threw down her backpack and paced near the smoldering remains of our campfire. "Because I don't know about you guys, but that wasn't the wind, and it sure as hell wasn't just rocks shifting." Emily hesitated, clutching her camera. "It could have been, I don't know, an echo? Old air pressure in the mine? There's a scientific explanation for stuff like that. An echo that says, 'Don't leave'?" "Really?" Amanda snapped, glaring at her. Kevin sat down heavily on a log, rubbing his temples. "I mean, there was something off about that place, but maybe it's just our nerves. You know, power suggestion or whatever." I couldn't stand it anymore. "Guys, stop." My voice came out sharper than I intended. "I don't know what it was, but something is wrong here. The mine, the carvings, the bones, none of it adds up. We need to keep our heads and get through the night." Nobody argued, but the tension was palpable. We huddled around the fire, eating in uneasy silence, the forest pressing in on us. That's when the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves. But as the night deepened, they grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out floated on the cool breeze, wrapping around the campsite like a noose. "Do you hear that?" Amanda whispered, clutching her sleeping bag tightly. I nodded, my stomach twisting. "Stay close to the fire," I said. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, darting through the trees, circling us like predators. Occasionally, I thought I heard my name, soft, distorted, and just out of reach. Emily's camera clicked suddenly, making us all jump. "What are you doing?" Kevin hissed. "I thought I saw something," Emily said, her voice trembling. She raised the camera again, snapping photos of the dark forest. "It's just shapes, I think. Shadows. Or someone," Amanda muttered. The fire crackled loudly, sending a plume of sparks into the air, and the whispers grew louder. This time, they carried a strange, rhythmic tone, almost like chanting. My skin crawled as I realized the words were clearer now, though still unintelligible. "Emily," I said, my voice low, "put the camera down. We don't need to antagonize whatever this is." "I'm not antagonizing," she began, but then froze, staring at the screen. "What is it?" I asked. She turned the camera around, and my heart nearly stopped. There, in the background of one of the shots, was a figure, a pale, gaunt shape standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. "We're not alone," Emily whispered. A branch snapped nearby, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the whispers swelled, a cacophony of disjointed voices that drowned out everything else. "We need to leave," Amanda said, her voice barely audible over the din now. But deep down, I knew leaving wasn't going to be that simple. By midnight, the whispers had become unbearable. They weren't just disembodied sounds anymore. They were inside our heads, pressing against our thoughts, weaving themselves into our breathing. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a voice, every snapping twig a sinister intent. None of us could sit still, and the fire seemed too dim, too fragile against the oppressive dark surrounding us. "We can't just sit here," Amanda said, her voice trembling. She clutched her jacket as if it could shield her from what was closing in. "It's like they're getting closer." "Where do you suggest we go?" Kevin snapped, pacing near the edge of the firelight. His bravado had crumbled entirely. Running blindly into the woods isn't going to help. Emily stared at her camera, her face pale. "It's the mine," she said quietly. It all started there. The whispers, the feeling. Whatever this is, it's tied to that place. "No way," I said, shaking my head. "You want to go back to that death trap? That's insane." But Amanda surprised me. "She's right," she said, swallowing hard. "It's like it's pulling us. If we don't face it, it's not going to stop." I wanted to argue, to tell them we'd be safer staying put until daylight, but the truth was, I felt it too. That magnetic pull toward the mine, like a thread wrapped around my ribs, tugging me back to its dark, gaping maw. "Fine," I said finally, grabbing the flashlight and slinging my pack over my shoulder. "But we go together. Nobody splits off. And if anything happens, we leave immediately." "Got it." No one argued. The hike back to the mine was suffocating. The forest, which had felt eerie during the day, now felt alive, like it was watching, listening. Shadows danced just out of reach of our flashlights, and the whispers followed us every step of the way, louder now, almost taunting. When we reached the mine shaft, the air grew unnaturally cold. My breath fogged in front of me, and a wave of nausea hit me like a punch to the gut. The entrance looked even more foreboding in the darkness. The wooden beams groaned faintly, and a strange, almost metallic smell wafted out from the depths. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered. We all stopped, straining to listen. At first it was faint, like the tapping we'd heard before. But as we stood there, it grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It sounded like something walking. "Let's get this over with," I said, though my legs felt like lead as I moved toward the entrance. Inside, the darkness was absolute. Our flashlights barely pierced it, illuminating crumbling walls and old, rusted tracks. Every step we took echoed, and I could feel the weight of the earth above us pressing down. Emily stopped abruptly, raising her camera. "There," she said, pointing to a spot just ahead. I squinted and my stomach dropped. On the wall, carved deep into the stone, were symbols, intricate, jagged shapes that seemed to shift when the light hit them. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and they radiated unease. "What is this?" Amanda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Emily said, snapping a photo. "But they look old, really old." "Too old to be here," Kevin muttered. The whispers suddenly surged, louder than ever. They weren't coming from behind us anymore. They were coming from deeper inside the mine. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shape at the edge of our flashlight beams, a hunched, indistinct figure that seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising off asphalt. But as it stepped closer, it solidified into something much worse. Its body was gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, with joints that seemed to bend the wrong way. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its bones, and its face was a nightmare. Hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth was too wide, filled with jagged yellow teeth. It stared at us for a moment, unblinking, as if studying us. Then it smiled. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the mine. "Run," I said, my voice barely a breath. But no one moved. We were frozen, trapped by its gaze, as it took another step closer. "Run!" I screamed, breaking the spell. We bolted, our footsteps echoing wildly as we fled toward the entrance. The creature let out a screech that pierced my skull, and the ground seemed to shake beneath us. I glanced back and saw it coming, its movements jerky but impossibly fast. Emily tripped, her flashlight skittering across the ground. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet as the creature lunged. Its claws swiped inches from her back as we stumbled out of the mine and into the night. The moment we crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped and the forest fell silent. But I knew we weren't safe yet, not even close. We burst out of the mine like bullets, gasping for air and tripping over our feet as the oppressive darkness gave way to the cold night. The silence outside was jarring, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. But the brief moment of relief shattered when we heard it, a guttural screech that tore through the stillness. "It's coming!" Amanda screamed, clutching her side as she ran. "Keep moving!" I yelled, glancing back just in time to see the creature emerge from the mine. It was more horrifying in the moonlight, its twisted limbs moving unnaturally fast as it gave chase. Emily trailed behind, her camera swinging wildly from its strap. "I can't, my leg!" she cried, stumbling over a root. I doubled back and grabbed her arm, practically dragging her forward. You have to keep going. Don't stop. The path back to camp felt endless. The once familiar trail now seemed alien. The trees closing in around us, their long shadows stretching like claws. The creature wasn't far behind. I could hear its raspy breath, its limbs snapping branches as it tore through the underbrush. Kevin, ahead of us, turned his flashlight toward the creature, hoping to slow it down. "Take this, you freak!" he yelled, throwing a rock. The beam of light hit its face, revealing a horrifying grin stretched across its gaunt features. The creature didn't even flinch. It let out another piercing screech and lunged forward, its elongated arms slashing at the air. "Don't look back!" I shouted, forcing Emily to keep moving. We reached the edge of the campsite, the dying embers of our fire barely illuminating the clearing. The RV loomed ahead like a beacon, and for a moment, hope flickered in my chest. "Get in," Kevin yelled, fumbling with the keys as we sprinted toward the vehicle. Amanda reached the door first, practically throwing herself inside. Kevin climbed in after her, and I shoved Emily ahead of me, slamming the door behind us just as the creature reached the clearing. The RV rocked violently as the creature slammed into it, its claws scraping against the metal with a sound that made my teeth ache. Emily screamed, pressing herself against the far wall as the windows fogged up from the creature's foul breath. "What do we do?" Amanda cried, tears streaming down her face. Kevin scrambled to start the engine, his hands shaking. "Come on. Come on." The engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. The creature slammed into the RV again, rocking it so hard that I nearly lost my balance. "Come on," Kevin yelled, hitting the dashboard. Finally, with a groan and a roar, the engine roared to life. Kevin floored the gas, and the RV lurched forward, throwing us all off balance. The creature shrieked, slamming its body against the back of the RV as we sped down the uneven trail. I looked out the rear window and saw its glowing eyes disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop driving until the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The sun was rising by the time we reached the nearest ranger station, its golden light cutting through the misty forest like a lifeline. None of us spoke as Kevin parked the RV, the engine sputtering one last time before falling silent. The vehicle was battered, its side dented and streaked with deep claw marks. Inside, the silence was suffocating. Each of us trapped in our thoughts, replaying the nightmare that had chased us from the mine. Amanda was the first to break the silence. What was that thing?" Her voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. "No one's going to believe us," Kevin said, staring blankly out the cracked windshield. "They'll think we're crazy." I leaned back against the seat, my hands still trembling. "It doesn't matter what they think. We're alive. That's all that matters." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The ranger on duty was an older man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. When we stumbled into his office, our faces pale and clothes torn, he didn't ask the usual questions. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he already knew. "You were near the mine, weren't you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "How did you—" Emily began, but the ranger cut her off. "You're lucky to be here. Most people don't come back from that place." He leaned forward, his expression grim. "That mine should have been sealed decades ago. Whatever's down there, it doesn't like to be disturbed." We tried to explain, but the ranger shook his head. "I don't need the details," he said. "Just promise me you won't go back." We nodded, though the thought of returning was unthinkable. The ride home was quiet. None of us could shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the creature's glowing eyes were hidden somewhere in the trees waiting. Weeks later, I tried to process what had happened, but there were no answers. The photos Emily had taken were gone, corrupted beyond recognition, as though the memory of that night refused to be captured. The whispers still haunt me sometimes, echoing in the quiet moments when I'm alone. And I know one thing for certain. I'll never step foot in Opal Creek again. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. So, what do you think? Was it just our imagination running wild, or was something truly lurking in the shadows of Opal Creek? I'll let you decide, but one thing's for sure. Some places are better left unexplored. If you've ever experienced something strange, something unexplainable, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever felt that eerie sense of being watched or stumbled across something you couldn't explain while hiking or camping? Share your story with us. It might just send chills down someone else's spine. If you found this story as terrifying and fascinating as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another spine-tingling tale. Every week, we dive into the most haunting, real-life stories from the wilderness, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Also, if you know someone who loves creepy stories or enjoys hiking in the Pacific Northwest, share this video with them. You never know, it might just make them think twice before wandering off the trail. Thanks for joining me on this chilling journey. Remember, the wilderness holds beauty, mystery, and sometimes things that are better left undiscovered. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep your flashlight close, your instincts sharp, and whatever you do, don't follow the whispers. Have you ever heard your own voice echoing through the woods when you knew you didn't speak? It's one of those moments where your gut tightens, your skin crawls, and your mind races to explain the unexplainable. That's exactly what happened to me. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the kind of silence that isn't natural. My legs were burning as I tore through the trees, branches clawing at my arms, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, something was following, no, hunting. It wasn't human. I don't even think it was animal. All I knew was that it wasn't stopping. And then I heard it. Daniel. It was my voice, unmistakable and clear, calling from deep within the forest. But I hadn't said a word. My breath hitched, and I risked a glance over my shoulder. There it was, a hunched silhouette shifting between the shadows, its glowing yellow eyes locked onto me. What do you do when something that shouldn't exist knows your name? When it mimics you, taunts you, and makes you question your own sanity? What happened in the hollow wasn't just a story. It wasn't some campfire tale to scare tourists. It was real. And if you think you're safe in the woods, think again. Want to know how it ends? Stick around. But first, hit like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. I promise, you won't want to miss this. Because not everyone who goes into the hollow comes out alive. It all started with my sister Emily. She always had a knack for convincing people to do things they didn't want to do. This time, her bright idea was a weekend trip to the Hollow, an isolated area in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. It's untouched by tourists, she said, her eyes lighting up as she showed me photos of the place online. We need this, a chance to disconnect, to reconnect with nature. It'll be perfect. I wasn't so sure. The hollow sounded remote, too remote. There wasn't even a proper campsite, just a vague map and some online posts about how peaceful and untamed it was. But Emily was relentless, and soon enough, she roped in 2 more people, Michael Carter, my best friend, and Sarah Brooks, his girlfriend. They thought it sounded like an adventure. Me? Not so much. We rented a creaky old RV for the weekend. By the time we packed it full of sleeping bags, canned food, and Emily's ridiculous amount of camera gear, it was groaning like it might fall apart before we even reached the forest. Michael, of course, tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes about premium camping luxury. Sarah sat quietly in the back, flipping through a book about local Native American legends. She had a thing for folklore, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The drive out there was long, the road winding through endless stretches of pine trees and misty hills. As we climbed higher, the sky grew darker, the air colder. The RV's generator sputtered off and on, and the headlights flickered like some cheap horror movie prop. "This is fine," Michael joked, giving the dashboard a half-hearted slap. But the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. When we finally reached the forest, it was almost sunset. Emily checked the map again, frowning. "The campsite should be just up ahead," she said, but we never found it. Instead, we parked in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, the kind that blocked out all but a sliver of the fading light. "This'll do," Emily announced, grabbing her camera. I stepped out of the RV, the cold air biting at my skin. The forest was silent, too silent. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. Something about this place felt wrong. Little did I know, it was only the beginning. The first night in the hollow was when things started to feel off. After we parked the RV in that isolated clearing, Emily was buzzing with excitement. She rushed out with her camera, snapping pictures of the towering trees and the eerie twilight filtering through the branches. Meanwhile, Michael and I set up a makeshift fire pit, and Sarah wandered a few feet into the woods, thumbing through her book on native legends. "Did you know this area is sacred to the tribes that used to live here?" Sarah said, her voice quiet but thoughtful. "There are stories about this forest, warnings, really." She glanced at Emily, who was lining up a shot of the clearing. "They believed there were places in the woods you weren't supposed to go. Let me guess, cursed burial grounds or something?" Michael teased, tossing a stick into the growing fire. "Not exactly," Sarah replied, flipping a page. "More like places where the world is thin, where things cross over." I rolled my eyes. "Okay, well, let's make sure we don't accidentally stumble into another dimension." By the time the fire crackled to life, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the clearing was bathed in darkness. We ate a quick dinner of canned chili, the four of us huddled close to the fire for warmth. The silence of the forest was deafening. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots from owls. Just the occasional pop of the firewood. And then we heard it. At first, it sounded like a low growl, deep guttural, and far too loud to be a coyote. It moved slowly, circling the RV and the fire. My stomach clenched as I exchanged a glance with Michael. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Michael shrugged, though his uneasy expression gave him away. "Probably just an animal. This is their turf, after all." But Sarah frowned, her eyes scanning the dark forest. "That didn't sound like any animal I know," she said. Emily, of course, dismissed it entirely. "Relax, you guys." "It's nothing," she said, though her voice was a little too cheerful. But it didn't feel like nothing. That growl, it sounded wrong, almost like laughter. And it wasn't the only thing I noticed that night, because just before I went to bed, I saw them footprints. Big, clawed prints pressed deep into the dirt, circling the RV. The next morning, Emily was up at dawn, camera slung over her shoulder as she practically dragged us out of the RV. "Come on, sleepyheads. The light's perfect right now," she called, already several paces ahead. Her excitement was infectious, but it didn't erase the unease that had settled over me the night before. As we followed a faint, overgrown trail deeper into the forest, the sense of isolation grew. The towering pines loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to block out most of the sunlight. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang I couldn't quite place. After an hour or so of hiking, we stumbled upon it, the stone circle. It was nestled in a small clearing, the trees surrounding it forming a natural, shadowy wall. The stones were large and jagged, covered in thick moss and faint carvings. At first, I thought they were just weathered rocks, but as I got closer, I realized the carvings weren't random. They were deliberate. Symbols that looked ancient and alien, their meanings impossible to decipher. "Whoa!" Emily whispered, crouching to examine one of the stones. Her fingers brushed against the faint markings. "This is incredible. It's got to be some kind of ancient site. Maybe Native American?" Sarah, who had been quiet for most of the hike, suddenly froze. She stared at the stones, her face pale. "No," she said softly. "This isn't theirs." Michael raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? If it's not Native American, then who made it?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I read about things like this. Markers, warnings." She pointed to one of the carvings. "This symbol, it's meant to keep people out." "Or keep something in," I muttered, earning a sharp glance from Emily. "Come on, you guys," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's just an old stone circle. You're all letting your imaginations run wild." She pulled out her camera and began snapping photos, circling the site like it was a museum exhibit. But Sarah didn't move. "Emily," she said firmly, "we shouldn't touch this. We shouldn't even be here." "Seriously?" Emily replied, clearly annoyed. "We came all this way. I'm not leaving without documenting it." Michael, always the jokester, leaned down and squinted at one of the stones. "What do you think will happen if I say some ancient curse words? Should I chant or something?" "Don't!" Sarah snapped, her voice sharp enough to make us all jump. For a second, her eyes darted to the trees, as if she was expecting something or someone to appear. "Just don't." Her fear was contagious. I felt it too, an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The air in the clearing felt wrong, thicker, colder, as though we were being watched. "All right," I said, breaking the tension. "Let's just get out of here." But Emily wasn't ready to leave. As she knelt down to get a closer shot, her camera suddenly stopped working. "What the hell?" she muttered, smacking it lightly. And then, in the heavy silence, we heard it again, that low, guttural growl. This time, it was closer. We practically jogged back to the RV after that. Even Emily, who'd been so excited to document the stone circle, looked shaken. She didn't admit it, but the way her eyes darted around the forest told me everything I needed to know. The growl had been too close, too loud. That evening, we tried to settle in. Emily was fidgeting with her camera, muttering about how it still wasn't working, and Michael cracked open a beer, pretending everything was fine. But no one was buying it. Sarah sat by the window, staring into the dark woods like she was expecting something, or someone, to emerge. I didn't want to admit it, but I was rattled too. The carvings, the growl, the silence of the forest. It was all stacking up in my mind, a growing sense of dread I couldn't shake. And then it happened. David, Emily's voice broke the silence, soft and uncertain. I looked up from where I was sitting near the door. Yeah, she froze, her face going pale. Did you just call me? No, I said, confused. Why? Her eyes flicked to the window. I heard you, back on the trail earlier. You called my name. Twice. I frowned. Emily, I didn't call you. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Maybe it was the wind, Michael offered weakly, though even he didn't sound convinced. But Sarah shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't the wind. No one said anything after that. We all sat there, the fire crackling weakly in the background, until the smell hit us. It was sudden and overwhelming, rotting meat and wet fur. Michael gagged and reached for the door to check outside, but Sarah grabbed his arm. Don't, she said, her voice sharp. Michael looked at her, confused. Why not? What if it's an animal? Sarah's eyes were wide, her face pale. It's not an animal. It's trying to draw us out. Her words hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't want to find out. And then, through the stillness of the night, I heard it. My own voice calling from the woods. David. My stomach dropped. It was me. It sounded exactly like me, but I hadn't said a word. The next day, Emily was determined to see the hollow. No amount of pleading or arguing from the rest of us could sway her. We're already here, she said, shouldering her backpack. I'm not leaving without seeing it. This is what we came for. Sarah was furious, her voice shaking with anger. Emily, we should leave. Did you not hear what we all heard last night? Something is wrong with this place. Michael chimed in, though his usual bravado had been replaced with unease. Yeah, maybe Sarah's right. Let's just pack up and go. But Emily wouldn't budge. You guys can stay here if you want, but I'm going. I sighed, feeling the tension in the group reach a boiling point. Fine, I said, grabbing my gear. But we stick together, and if anything feels off, we turn back. Agreed. No one answered, but they all reluctantly followed. The trail to the hollow was overgrown, barely more than a faint path through thick underbrush. It felt like the forest was closing in around us, the trees growing denser and darker with every step. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch. About halfway there, we found claw marks on the trees, deep, jagged gouges that looked fresh. Cougar, maybe, Michael muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. No, Sarah said quietly, tracing the marks with her fingers. This is something else. By the time we reached the hollow, I was sweating despite the cool air. The trail opened up into a natural amphitheater, surrounded by towering rock walls that seemed to stretch into the sky. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the eerie stillness made my skin crawl. It was beautiful, sure, but in the way that makes your stomach knot with dread. This is it, Emily whispered, awe in her voice. She immediately began setting up her camera. While she worked, the rest of us stood near the edge of the clearing, too unnerved to relax. That's when I heard it again. David, my own voice faint and distant, echoing through the rocks. I spun around, my heart hammering. Did you hear that? Michael nodded, his face pale. It sounded like me. I finished, my voice trembling. Emily froze, lowering her camera. Okay, seriously, stop trying to scare me. But Sarah grabbed her arm. "We need to leave. Now." Before anyone could respond, a shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then it stepped into the light. The creature was gaunt, its body hunched and wrong, its limbs too long and its movements jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed faintly yellow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. For a moment, none of us could move. The sheer wrongness of it paralyzed us. And then it spoke. Emily. The voice was hers. It took a step forward, and the air grew colder. The creature moved closer, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. Every step it took felt deliberate, almost calculated, as though it enjoyed watching us squirm. My chest tightened, and I instinctively reached for the hunting knife strapped to my pack, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. "Back away," Sarah hissed, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the rest of us. "Don't make eye contact." But Emily couldn't look away. She stood frozen, her face pale, as the creature stopped just a few feet from her. Then it spoke again, its voice identical to Emily's. "Why are you leaving? Don't you want to stay?" Hearing her voice come from that thing was the most unsettling moment of my life. It wasn't just mimicking, it was mocking. "Run," I whispered, but no one moved. The creature cocked its head, its grotesque grin widening. Then it lunged. "Get down!" I shouted, grabbing Emily and dragging her to the ground as the thing swiped a clawed hand through the air, narrowly missing her. Michael grabbed a thick branch from the ground and swung it, but the creature barely flinched as though it snapped against its skeletal frame. "It's not going to." "Stop!" Sarah yelled, fumbling in her pack for something. "We have to confuse it. Don't let it focus on any of us." "Over here," Michael shouted, waving his arms and backing toward the edge of the clearing. The creature turned to him, its limbs twitching unnaturally, and lunged again. While it was distracted, Sarah pulled a small pouch from her pack. She ripped it open, scattering its contents, a fine powder, into the air. "What the hell is that?" I asked, coughing as the powder hung in the air. "Salt and sage," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Just keep moving." The creature let out a shriek, its form flickering like a bad signal on an old TV. It stumbled back, swiping at the air as though trying to claw its way through the smoke. "This is our chance." "Go!" I yelled. We bolted, sprinting down the trail as the creature's shrieks echoed behind us. We tore through the forest, our feet pounding against the uneven ground, hearts racing like drums in our ears. The creature's shrieks echoed behind us, rising and falling in an unnatural, inhuman cadence. Every time we thought we had gained distance, the sound seemed to leap closer, like it was right on our heels. "Don't stop!" I shouted, my voice breaking with panic. "Just keep going." Branches clawed at our faces and arms as we ran, the dense underbrush turning the trail into a maze. Emily stumbled over a root, falling hard onto her knees. "Help me!" she cried, her voice trembling. I skidded to a stop, grabbing her arm and yanking her back to her feet. Michael and Sarah were just ahead, looking back, their faces pale with fear. "Move, Emily," I urged, practically dragging her forward. And then we heard it, the sound of branches snapping, louder and closer than before. The creature wasn't just chasing us. It was toying with us, deliberately driving us deeper into the woods. "It's circling us," Sarah shouted, her eyes darting around. "It's trying to cut us off. Do you see it?" Michael yelled, gripping his makeshift branch weapon tighter. "No, but it's close." I panted, "Too close." Suddenly, the forest opened up into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the ground in pale silver, and for a fleeting moment I thought we'd found some semblance of safety. But then the creature appeared at the edge of the clearing, its hunched silhouette lit by the moon, glowing eyes fixed on us. It let out a guttural, bone-chilling roar that froze us in place. Then it charged. "This way!" Sarah screamed, grabbing a handful of Emily's jacket and pulling her toward a cluster of boulders at the far end of the clearing. We scrambled up the rocks, our legs burning as we climbed. The creature reached the base, its long arms swiping at the air just below our feet. "What do we do now?" Michael shouted, his voice cracking. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stare down at the thing as it clawed at the rock face, its mouth twisting into that horrible grin. "Whatever happens," I said, my voice shaking, "we don't stop." The first rays of dawn cut through the trees as we stumbled out of the forest, our bodies bruised and battered, our nerves shot. None of us spoke, the silence between us thick with disbelief and exhaustion. When we reached the ranger station, the man behind the counter didn't seem surprised by our wild-eyed looks or frantic recounting of what happened. He listened quietly, his face grim. "You're lucky it let you leave," he said finally, his voice low. "The Hollow doesn't usually give second chances." "What is that thing?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The ranger hesitated, then shook his head. "Some places just aren't meant for people. The Hollow has always been different. Whatever's out there, it's older than us. Smarter, too. And it doesn't like being disturbed." We left Wallowa Whitman National Forest that same day, our camping gear abandoned where we'd fled. No one argued about it. Emily stopped taking photos. Michael moved to another state. Sarah refused to talk about the trip at all. As for me, I still hear it sometimes. My own voice calling from the woods in the dead of night. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never go back. Have you ever been somewhere so quiet, so vast, that you start to wonder if you're truly alone? That's exactly how I felt on my first night at Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge. The stars were brilliant. The desert stretched endlessly, and I thought I'd found the perfect escape. But then the silence changed. It started with a single light, just one, hovering faintly over the ridge in the distance. I thought it was nothing, maybe a reflection, a camper far off. But as I watched, more lights appeared. They moved unnaturally, zigzagging through the desert like they had a purpose. The air grew colder, and then I heard it, a whisper. Soft at first, just the faintest murmur, but then louder. I spun around. Was someone there? The whisper sounded so close, almost inside my head, but no one was there. Just the empty desert, or so I thought. I tried to shake it off, but that feeling, the weight in the air, the growing dread, was suffocating. I ran back to my RV and locked the door, but the whisper followed. What was it? Why was it happening to me? I didn't realize it then, but I'd already crossed a line. The land wasn't empty. It was alive, and it didn't want me there. Stick around to hear how this peaceful trip turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. By the end, you might just question whether some places should remain untouched. Like, comment, and let me know if you think you'd have survived what I saw at Heart Mountain. I had been craving solitude for months. Life had become too noisy, too heavy, and I needed somewhere to clear my head. That's why I chose Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge. Nestled in the high desert of southeastern Oregon, it promised exactly what I was looking for: silence, isolation, and a landscape so untouched it felt like stepping back in time. I'd read about the refuge online. Thousands of acres of open terrain, natural hot springs, and herds of wild antelope. The photos were breathtaking, and the thought of spending a week alone, far away from the chaos of daily life, was exactly what I needed. My RV, an old but reliable Class C, was my mobile escape. I stocked it with enough supplies for a week, packed my camera, hiking gear, and a few books, and hit the road. The drive out there was uneventful, but the scenery shifted the closer I got. The lush green forests of western Oregon gave way to the dry, rugged terrain of the high desert. The air was crisp, the sky an endless blue, and the roads wound through vast, open spaces where the only signs of life were the occasional hawk circling above, or a rabbit darting across the road. When I arrived at the refuge, it was everything I'd imagined and more. There were no other campers in sight, just an expanse of sagebrush, rocky ridges, and distant mountains. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a trailhead where I could easily hike to the natural hot springs the next morning. Before I settled in for the evening, I stopped by the small visitor station, hoping to grab a map and learn a little more about the area. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named Bill, eyed me curiously as I walked in. "Camping out here alone?" he asked, his tone both amused and slightly concerned. "Yeah," I said with a smile, looking forward to some peace and quiet. He didn't smile back. Instead, he leaned forward on the counter and said, "This place, it's not like other parks. The land's got history. People have seen things out here, things they can't explain." "What kind of things?" I asked, half laughing. He paused, staring out the window for a moment before answering. "Lights, whispers, shadows that move when there's no one to cast them. Most folks don't stay long after dark." I laughed again, but it sounded hollow even to me. "Thanks for the heads up. Just stick to the main trails," he said, his voice low. "And don't mess with anything you find out here. Some things are better left alone." I brushed off his warning as campfire talk, the kind of spooky story rangers tell to keep tourists on edge. But that night, as I watched the stars from my campsite, his words lingered. What could possibly go wrong in a place this quiet? The first day passed peacefully, almost too perfectly. I hiked to the hot springs, soaking in the warm, mineral-rich water while the breeze whispered through the sagebrush. The land felt vast, untouched, and timeless. It was exactly what I had hoped for. But as I made my way back to the RV, something began to shift. It started with the silence. The desert, normally alive with the faint rustle of wind and the chirp of crickets, had gone still. Not a single sound, not even the faint hum of insects. I paused mid-step, scanning the landscape, but there was nothing. No movement, just the oppressive weight of silence pressing down on me. Back at the campsite, I tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to the isolation. After all, I wanted to get away from people, hadn't I? But that evening, as the sun sank below the ridges and the stars began to scatter across the sky, the feeling came back, stronger this time. It was the lights that caught my attention first. Tiny orbs, faint but undeniable, flickering near the ridge to the east. At first, I thought they might be fireflies, but the way they moved wasn't natural. They darted back and forth in deliberate patterns, like they were searching for something or someone. Must be headlights from a distant camper. I muttered to myself, though the nearest campsite was miles away. As I watched, the orb suddenly disappeared, swallowed by the night. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, like wind brushing against my ear, but it carried a distinct, rhythmic cadence. Words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach clenched as I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the dark. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. The beam of light caught nothing but sagebrush and shadows. The whisper came again, closer this time. It wasn't wind. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was out there. I bolted back into the RV, locking the door behind me. As I sat there in the dim glow of the overhead light, every sound felt amplified. The creak of the RV, the faint rustle of the wind. Every noise made my heart race. I told myself it was nothing, just the desert playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I couldn't shake the strange feeling from the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild in the quiet solitude of the desert. Determined to distract myself, I decided to explore a nearby trail marked on the map I'd picked up at the visitor station. It led toward an old ridge that promised sweeping views of the refuge. The hike started out uneventful, the crunch of gravel under my boots breaking the stillness of the morning. But as I climbed higher, the air felt heavier, the landscape more desolate. The beauty of the refuge was still there, but it carried an unsettling weight, as though the land itself was watching me. About halfway up the ridge, I noticed something odd. A faint path, barely visible, veered off the main trail. It wasn't marked on the map, but curiosity got the better of me. The narrow track wound through patches of sagebrush and jagged rocks, leading deeper into a shadowed gully. That's when I found it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a cluster of boulders. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't random at all. They had been arranged. A stone circle, weathered and ancient, sat hidden in the gully, surrounded by an eerie silence. The rocks were etched with symbols, faint but unmistakable, spirals and jagged lines that didn't seem natural. I crouched to examine one of the stones, running my fingers over the carvings. They were rough, almost frantic, as though whoever had made them was in a hurry or in fear. "What is this?" I murmured to myself, my voice barely above a whisper. As I stood up, a strange sensation washed over me. The air felt colder, the silence deeper. It was the same oppressive stillness I'd felt the night before. And then I noticed something else, an object in the center of the circle. It was small, barely noticeable at first, buried in the dust. I hesitated before reaching down to pick it up. It was a fragment of bone. Animal, I hoped, but its jagged edges and weathered texture made my stomach churn. Surrounding it were other objects, shards of pottery, a rusted blade, and what looked like the remnants of a necklace, its beads dark and cracked with age. A part of me screamed to leave it alone, to walk away and pretend I hadn't seen it, but another part, fueled by curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. As I stood there, a gust of wind swept through the gully, carrying with it a faint, familiar sound, a whisper. "Go back." The word sent a chill down my spine, but when I whipped around, there was no one there. Just the empty desert and the jagged ridge towering above me. I stuffed the bone fragment back into the dirt and stumbled out of the gully, the whisper still echoing in my ears. Whatever this place was, I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, the unease I'd been trying to ignore began to claw its way to the surface. The RV, which had felt like a safe haven just a day earlier, now seemed fragile, like a thin shell barely keeping the darkness at bay. The air outside was still, and the night was suffocatingly silent. I sat by the tiny window, staring out at the black expanse of the refuge, but something felt off. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of everything. No insects, no rustling wind, No faint cries of distant animals. The world felt dead. As I tried to calm my nerves, I noticed something. A faint glow flickered on the ridge where I had hiked earlier that day. At first, I thought it might be headlights, but the light wasn't steady. It pulsed in an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat, faint and distant. Then came the whispers. They weren't inside the RV, but they were close, circling it like an invisible current of sound. At first, they were faint, almost indiscernible. But as I strained to listen, they grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic, unintelligible murmur. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as I stepped out into the cold night air. My heart pounded as I scanned the surroundings. The whispers stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. My flashlight caught something glinting in the dirt near the edge of the campsite. A rusted piece of metal, like a fragment of the blade I had seen in the stone circle. It hadn't been there before. A chill ran through me. Someone or something had been here. Suddenly, the RV groaned, rocking slightly as though someone had pushed it. I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the vehicle. My breath caught in my throat. On the window, pressed against the glass, was the faint outline of a handprint. Not an adult's, though. It was small, childlike. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. When I looked back up, the handprint was gone. I bolted back into the RV and locked the door, my mind racing. I was no longer alone in Heart Mountain. Something was watching, something that didn't want me there, and it was growing bolder. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV, every shift of the wind sent shivers down my spine. I kept replaying the events of the day, the stone circle, the strange carvings, the whisper in the gully, and that handprint on the glass. Something was out there, and it was toying with me. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the whispers. They started faint, just like before, but this time they didn't circle the RV. They were steady, deliberate, growing louder as if they were closing in. My chest tightened as I reached for the flashlight, my shaking hands fumbling to turn it on. Then came the sound of footsteps. They were soft, padding through the dirt, almost rhythmic. The sound stopped right outside the RV door. I froze, holding my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. But instead of leaving, it knocked. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The flashlight in my hand felt useless, but I couldn't just sit there. Slowly, I moved toward the door, every step heavy with dread. Peering through the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The desert was empty, or so it seemed. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the knocking came again, harder this time, shaking the flimsy door. I backed away, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft and eerily familiar. "Leah, open the door. It's me." It sounded like my sister's voice, but that was impossible. She was hundreds of miles away, and I knew she wouldn't just show up unannounced. "It's cold out here," the voice said, pleading. "Please let me in." I wanted to believe it was her. For a fleeting moment, I considered unlocking the door. But then I remembered the warnings, the whispers, and the handprint on the glass. This wasn't my sister. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. Suddenly, the RV shook violently, as though something massive had slammed into it. I fell to the floor, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The windows rattled, and the sound of scratching filled the air, nails dragging across the thin metal walls. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the pouch of herbs the ranger had given me. She said to burn them if I ever felt unsafe, and at this moment I felt anything but safe. I lit a match and held it to the bundle. The smoke curled into the air, sharp and acrid. The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, everything went still. Then I heard it, a high-pitched scream, inhuman and deafening, fading into the distance as though whatever was outside had been forced to retreat. I stood there, trembling, the burning herb still in my hand. Whatever had come to my door wasn't gone for good. It was waiting, and I knew this was far from over. The dawn broke over the Heart Mountain refuge, but the light didn't bring relief. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I hadn't slept at all. My nerves were frayed, my heart still racing from the night's terror. I knew one thing for certain. I had to leave. I packed in a frenzy, throwing clothes, food, and my camera into bags without care. Every sound outside the RV made me jump. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. In fact, it was worse in the daylight. Shadows danced in the corner of my vision, and faint whispers occasionally brushed against my ears. When I finally started the RV, the engine sputtered and groaned as if it, too, wanted to stay frozen in place. "Come on," I whispered desperately, slamming my hand against the dashboard. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I put the vehicle into gear. As I drove down the gravel road, I caught movement in my rear-view mirror, something darting between the sagebrush. I didn't dare stop to look closer. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. The whispers followed me. They clung to the air, faint but persistent, as if the thing, whatever it was, wasn't done with me yet. The landscape blurred past me, the mountains and flatlands melting together in a haze of panic. It wasn't until I saw the faint outline of the ranger station in the distance that I felt the weight begin to lift. I didn't stop until I was parked outside, running inside to find anyone, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. But even as I left the refuge, I knew I hadn't truly escaped. Some places don't let go that easily. Days have passed since I left Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge, but it hasn't left me. I replayed every moment in my mind. The whispers, the handprint on the RV, the thing that mimicked my sister's voice. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wanted me to stay. Back in town, I tried explaining what happened to the ranger I'd met. Her face paled as I described the stone altar and the voices in the dark. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded slowly, her expression grim. "People talk about Heart Mountain like it's untouched, a sanctuary," she said. "But not everything out there wants to be found. Some things, they protect what's theirs." I've avoided looking through my photos from the trip, too afraid of what I might see in the background. The few I glanced at showed faint shapes in the mist and shadows that didn't belong. One photo, taken near the altar, seemed to show a figure standing far in the distance, blurry but undeniably there. The nights since my escape have been the hardest. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear whispers just outside my window. When I do sleep, I dream of Heart Mountain, of being trapped there, of the thing that waited outside my RV. I haven't told my family everything. They wouldn't believe me, and I don't blame them. I can barely believe it myself. But one thing is certain, I'll never go back. If you're ever in Oregon and you hear someone talk about Heart Mountain, take my advice, stay far away. Because once you've been marked by whatever lives out there, I'm not sure it ever truly lets you go. So, what do you think? Would you ever dare to visit Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge after hearing what I went through? Let me tell you this. There are places in this world that are better left unexplored. Some landscapes may seem untouched and serene, but beneath that surface lies something far more sinister. If this story left you on the edge of your seat, take a moment to let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my place? Could you have stayed calm, or would you have packed up and left at the first sign of trouble? I'm curious to hear your take on it. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales like this one. It's your support that keeps us diving into these real-life mysteries, bringing you stories that remind us all why we should tread carefully, even in the most beautiful places. And hey, if you've experienced something strange yourself, whether it's out in the wilderness or in the middle of nowhere, drop your story in the comments. You never know who else might have gone through the same thing. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the eerie and unexplained. Because while my story ends here, the world is full of places like Heart Mountain, waiting to show you their secrets. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some places aren't meant to be disturbed. See you in the next story.